Alright, welcome everybody. This is going to be the mini or quick overview lecture for the week of Labor Day for both residency and online students. So this assumes that you've downloaded the full PowerPoint presentation from the Dropbox link in our Blackboard course. Because what you want to do is listen to me kind of give an overview of what you can read in the PowerPoint, what I call speaker notes, and that's the white box that shows up in the respective view underneath the PowerPoint slide itself. So oftentimes I'll throw up a PowerPoint slide that just captures the image or concept, and then I'll briefly talk about what's in the box that you can very well read for yourself. So it's just a little more efficient, and my goal is to not give you something that's longer than 30 minutes. So what we're going to do is cover some ground in the PowerPoint presentation. So last time we talked about the process of getting from author to text. What we'll pick up today is textual criticism, which is really the science of what scholars are studying after the period of the close of the canon in 400 BC. So what we talk about when we talk about the area of textual criticism is a discussion of the witnesses to the text and the versions to the text. Witnesses are Hebrew, written in Hebrew copies of the biblical books, and versions are translations of the Hebrew. And in some cases, those translations are the the New Living Translation type versions with a little extra interpretation thrown in. So we first want to talk about witnesses. We basically have three witnesses to the Old Testament. First and most common is the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text comes out of a period from 500 to 1000. It took the consonantal letters and added the vocalization. So the vowel letters, the vowel markings, if you get into Hebrew, you'll learn about that. And the accent markings. And the corrective comments were all a means of the Masoretic scribes working very hard and very meticulously to preserve the text. Another witness that we have is the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans were a community that were really the leftovers of that exilic experience with the northern tribes. They kept a copy and preserved a copy of just the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So what we do there is just we can compare the Samaritan Pentateuch to other witnesses and other versions of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The last one is the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably the most familiar with those of us around Southwestern. This is a collection of 221 texts and fragments. All but the book of Esther is included, dating from about 250 BC to about 135 AD. Now we talk about our versions. The versions are the translations. Most common or most popular, the most well-known is the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation from the Old Testament version that they had, the Old Testament version dating to about 250 to about 100 BC. It involved a lot of different scholars translating all the books of the Old Testament. The Aramaic Targums are another example of a translation into Aramaic. During the period where Aramaic was the more common spoken language of the common people, or we say lingua franca of the day, during the period of the Assyrian Empire. Finally, we have the translation into Latin from the Old Testament, which is the Latin Vulgate, and that dates to about 250 AD. Now the idea here is to, with the combination of the witnesses, which date back to about 250 BC, as far as the oldest, and the versions, those translations of the Old Testament, the science of textual criticism is the comparison of all of them together for the purpose of triangulating and locating that center point, which would be the closest we can get to the original text, the author text of the Old Testament, the autograph, you might say. And we talked about that last time. Now this is just basic cleanup work from the time of the close of the canon, from about 400 BC forward to about 1000 AD, which is when the Masoretics were working to basically put that final nail in the coffin on the preserved text. And that's really what we're working with when you take your Hebrew class. If you do, you'll be learning how to read the Masoretic text. But the work to preserve the text, which really started in around after 400 BC, we're only talking about a small percentage of discrepancies in the text. These are attributed to the scribes who were working basically from hearing someone read the Old Testament, and then they would write it down and copy it back in the days before copy machines. Or they would read it themselves and then copy it onto another parchment. So you would expect there'd be human error, which would be letter confusion, letters that have a similar shape, so in copying you'd misspell a word. What's called haplography, that would be an error of omission, leaving out a letter or a whole word. Or didography, which is an error of addition, adding an extra letter or word. So the science of textual criticism is basically lining up the Masoretic text and comparing it to the variant readings that are coming from other witnesses and other versions of the Old Testament. For example, here we have from the Masoretic text, "The Lord shall make heard." And here's one example of a variant that comes back from one of the Qumran copies of Isaiah, which says, "The Lord shall make heard, make heard." That would be an example of didography, which is words that would be duplicated or written multiple times. Then the second example, "I will leave the corpses of the Philistine army." Now from the Septuagint, or the LXX, we read, "I will leave your corpse and the corpses of the Philistine army." That's an example of haplography, or a word that is omitted. So the more correct version would be, in that case, the Septuagint. So you might be worried about this, but you don't have to be, because the text, actually the scribes who have worked in preserving the text have done a really, really excellent job in preserving the what we talked about last time is the autographs. If we compare the Qumran text, for example, to the Masoretic text, we have more than 95% of the text being the same. Only 5% variation, which basically consists of, like we said, scribal errors, slips of the pen, spelling alterations, etc. And there's a little statistical comparison to, really it boils down to no significant theological issues come out of the various readings that come from the study of textual criticism. So we conclude that we have a high degree of reliability with regards to the text. But what about the history behind the text, or the history that the text claims to give a report on? Were the biblical authors true to what they were reporting in their account, their theological and historical account of what happened? You know, we don't have carved on a tree anywhere, "I love Sarah," or "Abraham was here," or anything like that. But we do have some other clues that come out of the field of archaeology that help us, or give us more confidence in the fact that we have accurate history in our Old Testament. Here's just one example, pretty recently discovered, the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. Now this is interesting because it comes out of that famous Aaronic blessing in Numbers chapter 6. I'll sing it. We used to sing it to my kids growing up. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and give you peace." It comes out of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. And on an artifact dated to the 7th century BC, some 400 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the identical words coming from a what's called a scroll, which would have been worn around the neck and rolled together in a little tube. And that's the way they did it back then, before the days of post-it notes. And that's the oldest text that we have that lines up word for word with what we have in our Masoretic text. So that points to even before 400 BC, even before then, 400 years before, it looks like what we've got is a preservation of the text. Now you might ask, we can ask ourselves the question, why? Why would a believing community all along that time be concerned about preserving the words of Scriptures? Because they, like us, understood it to be God's authoritative and inspired word. Here's the Tel Dan inscription. Now this is important because critical scholars like to dismiss David, King David. He's just made up. He wasn't really a real king named David. It's kind of important, though, for evangelical conservative scholars. And recently, really, in 1993, they discovered on a portion of a monument an inscription that said House of David, and just in a line below, King in Israel. So it's the oldest out of the Bible reference to the real King David that we have, and that supports the biblical accounting of history and the whole story of King David that comes out of our Bible. Another example is the Kervet Kiafa inscription. Now, this is interesting because recently discovered near where the original Battle of David and Goliath was fought, on a piece of broken pottery, we have an example of scribal activity outside of a palace, outside of a capital city, but in just a military outpost. And this dates to the 11th to 10th century BC, in and around the time of King David and Solomon. So this is just an example of what would be called Proto-Hebrew, and there you have it, the old form of Hebrew, and more importantly, scribal activity that goes way back. So now we're going to change gears and talk about more of the history of scholarship and some of the big ideas in this area, really starting after the age of the Enlightenment, the whole blossoming of the whole scientific field, the scientific method. Everything had to be proved in a scientific laboratory. So everything was up for grabs. Everything had to be proved, including the Bible. So it went under great more scrutiny, you might say, with regards to scientific method. So let's talk about some of the outgrowths of this particular time in history. Some of the precursors to the scholarship were Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher, kicked out of the Jewish church, became a nominal Roman Catholic. He began to investigate the Bible, not theologically, but philosophically. So, he did some radical things, like reject the authority of the church and its text. He rejected the doctrine of divine inspiration. He questioned Mosaic authorship. He just claimed that the Pentateuch, for example, was a collection of, or a composition of the time of Ezra, post-exilic. Jean Ostruc was a French physician to King Louis XV. Now, he didn't set out to undermine traditional Mosaic authorship, but what he did was start to look for evidence in the text of sources, maybe sources behind the text. So he would look to, he would be a precursor to the ideas that we have in what's called the documentary hypothesis that we'll be looking at shortly. Different sources that line up, for example, with the names of God, Elohim and Yahweh. So he really began the whole discussion of what we call source critical analysis. So building on the whole Yahwist or J source and Elohist or E source, what we're talking about there are real authors, so-called, by the critical scholars. Then they added a D source called the Deuteronomist source. Davetti argued for a separate D source. He was the one that came up. He would argue that that source or that author would have produced it during the time of the King Josiah and his reforms. Later, the E source was broken out from what would be called the P, or the priestly source. All of this was put together by a really friendly-looking guy over there, Julius Wellhausen. And you can see the quote there. Even he kind of knew how his documentary hypothesis, the whole JEDP thing, was really not a friendly idea with his students. I did not come to understand that a professor of theology also has the practical task of preparing the students for service in the Protestant church. Hello? And that I am not adequate for this practical task, but that instead, despite all caution on my part, I make my hearers unfit for their office. Kind of felt a little guilty there. However, Graf was a precursor to Wellhausen. One of the ideas behind all of this was the fact that critical scholars in that day thought that it was pig-headed to think that Moses could have come down off of Mount Sinai talking about monotheism. In other words, there was this evolutionary, Darwinian actually, evolutionary idea even behind the development of religion. So what you'd have to talk about in those days was that monotheism was more sophisticated and came later. The early idea was not monotheism, but maybe paganism or animism, which then went to pantheism, the idea of everything is God, to polytheism, the idea of there's many gods, to henotheism, the idea that you can talk about, one God, but then there are other gods that you can refer to as well. Finally, to the idea of monotheism, the discussion of only one God. And that had to have come later in Israel's religious development, not early. In other words, Moses didn't come up with that idea. That came later. That's the basic idea there. So here's a nice schematic of the idea of the JEDP, or the documentary hypothesis. You've got the J author working just after the time of King David. Then later you've got an E author. So these two authors line up with their preference for the name of God, Yahweh and Elohim, during the time of Jeroboam or a little bit later. Then what we have, and I haven't explained this, is the R, or the redactor. The redactor is somebody who is hard to pinpoint in biblical history because there's no mention of the redactor or the office of the redactor, but they're the ones who put together the J and the E source into a single document. And as a result of the Josiah reforms, you've got the D source being originated, the D author, and then another redaction after the fall of Jerusalem. But just almost simultaneously you have the P author creating his document, and then a final redaction during the time of Ezra in the post-exilic period, stringing together all of the sources into what we would call the Pentateuch. And that's the documentary hypothesis. The implication is that you don't have one Moses, you have multiple Moseses, or schizophrenic Moses, or however you want to call them, JEDP Moses. That's the implication. So we can't talk about one author addressing Israel on the plains of Moab in preparation for entering the Promised Land. You've got that history, or that specific historical context, as a fabrication of all of these other authors. So that's a huge implication. So are we just going to put our heads in the sand about this? No. Any scientific hypothesis has to basically rest on what we would call pillars. Every hypothesis must stand or fall on the supportive pillars. So the documentary hypothesis has pillars, and we're going to quickly evaluate each one. All right, the first pillar is textual references to Moses. Or how can you have an author writing in third person about himself? Or specifically about Moses, the big one that you hear often is, how can Moses write about his own death in Deuteronomy chapter 34? Well, what we have is a response, and we have evidence in some other historical works of history. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, for example. You have an author writing about himself in third person. And what we'll talk about with Moses in Deuteronomy 34, you can still talk about Mosaic authorship and not have to talk about Moses writing about his own death. I think chapter 34 in Deuteronomy is probably a fitting tribute to the author of the Pentateuch by a scribe under the authority of Joshua, looking back and giving that fitting tribute, that last chapter, to the author of the Pentateuch, Moses. Another pillar is the reference to anachronisms. These are chronological lapses. So you've got reference in Genesis 21 and Genesis 26 to camels, which we all know were not domesticated until after 1000 BC. Yet what we find is that camels have recently shown up in cuneiform tablets or tables dated back to 18th century BC. So now we know that if we have an active 15th century BC author, namely Moses, referring to camels during the time of the patriarchs, we know that that is evidence of a historian actually being historically accurate, representing the people, places, and things of his account accurately to the times of those historical people, places, and things. One of the most common criticisms that we have is Pillar 3. So you've got author A, the Elohist, referring to God by the name Elohim, and you've got another author who comes along and refers to history with regards to Yahweh. That's the Yahwist, or the J source. And you've got a P author, the P source, referring to El Shaddai. All of those are names for God. But the response that we have is that it's not out of question to think of one author referring to all three names of God, depending on what kind of theological emphasis he wants to bring to his historical account and theological account. So that's how we respond. So for example, I'll show you in Genesis 1, the classic example there in Genesis 2:4, all the way through chapter 1 in Genesis, you have the reference to Elohim, or G-O-D in your English translation. And then all of a sudden in chapter 2, verse 4, you have capital L-O-R-D, which is a English translation of the name Yahweh. What's going on there? You've got Moses bringing theological emphasis. In chapter 2, verse 4, he says, Yahweh God. In the day Yahweh God created the heavens and the earth. Well, by the way, Moses is saying, look, Israel, the one who we met at Mount Sinai, the one who introduced himself to us by name Yahweh, he's the one who created the heavens and the earth. That's the theological emphasis. Another criticism that scholars throw at the Bible is that how can a single author talk about, say, the father of faith for Israel, that is Abraham, negatively, for example, presenting him as both liar, but on the other hand, presenting him as a great hero of faith? There's an obvious contradiction there. You can't have one author presenting a single individual both ways. But what we find when we look at the Old Testament is that all of the authors have no qualms about presenting their individuals that they're talking about, warts and all. You've got Abraham 2 steps forward and 1 step back with regards to his faith journey. And by the way, what a better example of faith, right, for Israel. Israel as a nation, individually and corporately, struggled with their faith, and here they are, Moses is giving them an accurate representation of their father of faith, that is Abraham, but presented warts and all. So that's the more realistic, I would say, life of faith for all of us, anytime in salvation history. And that was exactly Moses' point. One other example would be the idea of duplicates or duplicate narratives. So critical scholars will read Genesis 1, creation, 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 and Genesis 2, creation, creation, creation. Obviously we've got 2 authors there. One author's not going to repeat himself. But if you look at it closely, Genesis 2 is an amplification or a pericoping in on creation day 6, talking about the image of God bearer, Adam, and giving more details about his job description, what he's supposed to do, and how he's supposed to rightly bear the image of God as an image of God bearer. So a hypothesis is going to rise and fall on its supportive pillars. So we've just given you a response to every one of the pillars that supports the documentary hypothesis. So we don't need to have our heads in the sand with regards to the documentary hypothesis. We have a scholarly response that we can give to it. And we can talk about Mosaic authorship on firm terra firma, firm ground. Now another huge support for Mosaic authorship, now we're talking about positive evidence, not just talking negatively about somebody else's position. Now we're coming up with positive information or evidence for Mosaic authorship. One is with regards to covenant forms. What we've discovered from antiquity are examples of covenant forms that come out of Hittite treaties, covenant documents that go and date way back in the history of the ancient Near East. And what scholars have done is categorized and studied all of these these treaty and covenant forms. Basically, you have a grouping of covenant forms that date back to the 2nd millennium BC, and you have another grouping of covenant forms that date to the 1st millennium BC. And they're different. The 1st millennium BC covenant documents look different than the ones from the 2nd millennium BC. Then what we do is we study the biblical examples of covenants, and there I've given you some from Abraham, Genesis 21, for example, Isaac and Abimelech, Genesis 26, Jacob and Laban, Genesis 31. Looking at those examples of biblical covenants, what we find is that this is what those biblical covenants look like. And the first level subhead titles for those covenants are witnesses, oath, stipulations, and curses. If we compare that basic biblical form to the examples from the ancient world, what we find is this. Critical scholars would suggest that an author operating in the first millennium BC would present those biblical covenants like the covenant forms that come from the 1st millennium BC. But instead, what we basically find is something radically different. The biblical covenants from the biblical context look like the covenant forms that come from the 2nd millennium BC. And that's exactly the time period in which the patriarchs existed during the 2nd millennium BC. Abraham, 2000 BC, and then we get to Moses, the author, writing and operating in and around 1500 BC. So Moses is actually being an accurate historian when he's telling the historical story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph with regards to the covenant forms. But we're not done. We have more covenant forms that come from the time period of Moses himself, coming from Mount Sinai in Exodus 20 and the book of Deuteronomy. So what do we see there? We see another kind of covenant form emerge: title, historical prologue, stipulations, blessings, and curses. And if we compare that form to what we find from the ancient world, critical scholars would like to see that form line up with the operation of the author. So their critical theories would say authors operating in the 1st millennium BC. However, that's not what we find. What we find is that the forms that come from the biblical context in the books that we would suggest Moses wrote line up exactly when Moses would have been operating as an author. And that's positive evidence, because late 2nd millennium BC is exactly when we would want to see and when we would argue Moses was operating as an author. Interestingly, the only difference that we see is the omission of the purple section that you see there, the witnesses section. Why would we not see a witness section in the biblical examples? It's because it's assumed that there's just one God who's the witness, and that's Yahweh. Moses left that out because it's assumed by his audience emphatically that we don't have to have a God's list. There's only one God, so it's assumed the witness is Yahweh himself. So some scholars got a little tired of the documentary hypothesis and then wanted to go on to other things in their scientific analysis of the Bible. And one example is called form criticism or form analysis. Herman Gunkel is the example, and you can go pull his books off of our library shelves and benefit from them. They're going to build on and basically assume, though some of them, that Moses wasn't the author, but they do provide some helpful insights into the study of the Bible. And one that came out of form analysis is an interesting emphasis on genre, the genre. So, for example, Herman Gunkel studied folk tales that were in and around European history, ancient European history, came up with some genre type formats like hymns, laments, short stories, covenant documents, and etiologies, call narratives. Those are, those are the ones that come from the biblical context that he identified. And the etiology is a story or an explanation of how things came to be. Now he would say behind those biblical genres are the genres that come out of like civilizations of any age in history, like fairy tales, folk stories, legends. Hermann Gunkel would want to talk about, for example, Samson as an example of a legend, a novella, that would be the Joseph narrative, history, Samuel through Kings. Unfortunately, he'd talk about things like myth. That would be Genesis 2 through 3, the whole Adam and Eve in the garden thing. So we have to be careful about some of the conclusions that these critical scholars would come to. We were not going to say or agree with Hermann Gunkel that Adam and Eve were just mythical figures made up. We would recognize that them being real historical people, Adam and Eve, the first image of God bearers, according to the authors, both Old and New Testament, build pretty significant theological conclusions on a real Adam and Eve. Another thing that, but from the basic form analysis scholars, the idea of genre and the Sitzum Leben, or the setting in life, were basically bring emphasis to speaker, audience, and context. And those are all positive things that we can walk away from with regards to this particular form of biblical analysis or study. Another form of biblical study called tradition analysis, basically very close to form analysis, came from a German scholar, Martin Noth. And he tried to identify what would be called more of a tradition behind the biblical text, largely coming from what he would argue would be an oral tradition behind the text. So, for example, the promise to the ancestors, guidance out of Egypt, guidance in the wilderness, revelations from Mount Sinai, and then guidance in arable land. The problem with Martin Noth and others like him is that they had a low view for the historicity of the details of the text. They would talk about Moses as being a creation of later biblical writers, not as a real historical figure himself. So again, we have to take it with a grain of salt and have our thinking caps on when we pull books off the shelf, for example, written by Martin Noth, and understand what some of his conclusions might be on some of these more critical presuppositions. One of the German scholars along this tradition analysis or form analysis would be Gerhard von Rad. Interestingly, he's a German Lutheran pastor, and to his credit responded to the anti-Old Testament sentiment of his day. Now, when was he doing his research? In and around before World War II. Now, guess what was going on in Germany at the time? There existed an anti-bias against the Old Testament due to the anti-Semitism of the day, because the Old Testament taught the history of the Jewish people. So he worked to bring Old Testament, the idea, the teaching and theology of the Old Testament back into the church, and that was his primary motivating factor. So he applied all of the form criticism and tradition criticism and source criticism into his day, but basically emphasizing the theology, bringing it to the churches of his day, which was a good thing, actually. More recent scholars have developed what's called literary analysis, basically reading the text in its final form, away from the diachronical issues or the historical issues of author, audience, and sources and context, but more towards what we would call synchronic concerns. That is, final form of the text, what the text says, with less concern for, but not to the exclusion of, historical matters. What do we get out of literary analysis? Literary analysis will allow us to ask questions about the author. Why was the author selective? Why did the author arrange things this way? Why did the author shape the text in this particular way? Those are the kinds of questions that come out of literary analysis. So one classic example for selectivity is, why did the author of 2 Chronicles totally leave out David's sin with Bathsheba when he wrote, the author, that is, of Chronicles, wrote his historical accounting of the same events? We all know that David's sin with Bathsheba, but he left it out. And, that's the question that we ask. We ask ourselves the question about the author. Why did he leave it out? And he left it out for his own theological purposes. His audience already knew about the failures of the kings. Didn't need to be repeated. So that author spent a lot more time developing, for example, the good news for his audience. For example, the Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel 7. A lot more details given there about that, for example. One classic example of, for example, arrangement and sequence. The author of the book of Judges, for example. Every single cycle that we have of the Judges starts from, you might say, good to lukewarm, and every one gets a little worse theologically. And it's intended not to be sequential, but to be theological, because the author of Judges is screaming in terms of his evaluation, in terms of how things go from bad to worse. And by the end of the book of Judges, you get to a pretty dismal situation, and we're waiting for a superhero to show up on the scene and save the day. Well, when we get there, we'll figure out what's going on, but thankfully we have a breath of fresh air in the book of Ruth. Literary analysis also allows us to ask the questions about the author. How did the author bring about emphasis? So, for example, in the recounting of the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and 8, we have the repeated idea, the forever idea. The everlasting covenant is repeated several times in David's response, which brings emphasis to the idea of the eternal covenant, the Davidic covenant. Or in the name of Jacob, for example, in the patriarchal account, we have Jacob, whose name means heel grabber or deceiver, but at a pretty significant turning point in that patriarchal account, Jacob's name is changed to Israel, which means one who strives with God after the wrestling match. So that's a significant theological emphasis that the author is allowed to bring. But with all of these, might say, more modern critical approaches to the Old Testament, we have to be careful. When we read their commentaries on the book, on the shelves of our library, sometimes we have to be aware of the fact of their questionable assumptions. Some of them don't hold to biblical inspiration or inerrancy like evangelical scholars do. Sometimes they're based on biased scholarship. Sometimes these critical scholars put the Bible under, you might say, a ratcheted up scrutiny or intense scrutiny. And some of them don't like to even read what conservative scholars are producing and putting on the shelves right next to their book. It's just the way it is. But to be a conservative Old Testament scholar is a rewarding enterprise these days, because you can read the text and allow it to speak on its own terms. And that's an exciting thing. You can talk about Mosaic authorship, which I will do in week 3 of our class. So you'll see me trying to be a conservative Old Testament scholar. So what can we say about, for example, Mosaic authorship? Well, we can talk about positively Moses, the author, based on internal evidence. Moses being, for example, himself an eyewitness to the events that take place in Exodus 15:27. A Moses who had full acquaintance with Egypt and Egyptian culture. We have Moses being the one who'd be qualified to be an author based on his education, his Hebrew background, his knowledge of the geography. He had lots of time to write. being with Israel in their formative years in the wilderness, leading up to that plains of Moab experience. We also have external evidence with regards to the reference in Joshua 1:7, which refers to a Torah of Moses. So all of these things together combine to provide positive evidence for not Moses's, the documentary hypothesis, but a Moses. But when we talk about Moses authorship, we have to make things very clear for our Sunday school classes and our congregations and even our youth groups. What Mosaic authorship does not mean and does mean. First, what it does not mean. It does not mean that Moses had to write the entire thing with his own hand. Moses would have used scribes. It does not mean that Moses is responsible for the final shape of the Pentateuch. There may have been some updating based on language that would have changed over from the 15th century BC to the time of the exile and that 6th century BC period. Hebrew language underwent a change. Scribes over time in copying it would have updated it appropriately. And like I've said before, we don't have to say that Moses was responsible for writing about his own death in Deuteronomy 34 to be able to talk about Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. What it does mean, what does it mean? So I'll refer to the chart there. What it does mean, Moses would have incorporated pre-existing sources into his final work. For example, genealogies, Genesis 5, law codes, the Decalogue referred to in Exodus 20 in chapter 31, 32, 34, 26 through 28, covenant code that's referred to in Exodus 24, the reference to a memorial book in Exodus 17, the journal for the wilderness travels referred to in Numbers 33, the census list, for example, Numbers 1 and chapter 26, a booty list referred to in Numbers 31, boundary descriptions referred to in Numbers 34, and a book of the wars of Yahweh referred to in Exodus 17 and Numbers 21. So all of these things would have been sources that Moses would have had to have referred to and used in the writing down of his authenticating historical work called the Pentateuch. Other things that were written down. So what we want to say positively about Mosaic authorship is that Moses was an active author, educated, well-versed witnesses of the events that took place. But for the earlier patriarchal, back to the creation account itself, Moses may have been drawing from some other sources. But also, we have to recognize, though, like we talked about earlier, bringing that in under his hat of divine inspiration, working under the divine authority and bringing that in and writing it down probably. And then what we say with regards to the Pentateuch, the Pentateuch would have reached its final form probably in and around the time of Samuel the prophet in Israel's history. So just remember that when you're recording your journal summary in Blackboard, you are basically drawing from the reading. But in the case of week 2, what you'll have is the extra benefit of this short, what I would call a condensed lecture. So you've got the PowerPoints, use those as well and bring some of these things in, and then summarize high points with regards to your journal work. And I've given you now that other video that basically gives a feedback session based on what I'm looking for in your journal account. So hopefully that's all helpful, and